So today I wanted to continue up following with our train of thought and kind of break down for Mob and Psycho 100. So what we're going to be covering, I finished the first season, and so I've technically already started the second, but I want to go ahead and give my kind of final thoughts for it and kind of wrap it up in terms of kind of this focus on Mob Psycho as a whole, at least, possibly continue for season 2, but just depending on this. So I kind of wanted to just cover a few moments that I thought were really good and kind of helped advance the story and everything. So with the latter half of the season, I've kind of bunched them all together. I think it's like 7 to 12, basically. That's what we're looking at for the latter half from where I left off previously. We've got a few different plot points that had developed pretty well. So we've got the evil Ritsu, and Ritsu is the, let's get his hair right. Ritsu is kind of the younger brother that kind of plays almost an older brother of sorts. It's a bit weird that he's not the younger, because, I don't know, I felt it seems like it would have more likely been Ritsu been the older brother, but either way, that's neither here nor there. So basically, the evil Ritsu arc, where basically what this does is it provides, of course, conflict, which is what the bulk of where all stories basically come from. There's only a handful of ones where there's not really much conflict. The only good example I can think of that does this well enough is Colorless Tezaki by Haruki Murakami, where there's not exactly direct conflict, it's kind of more like past conflict, basically. But basically, this is kind of what provides the classic building block for a story, essentially, is you have a character, and they are going for a goal. And during this, a obstacle stands in their way. And this is a story. This is the drama. The story part comes from basically what I see as the potential to fail. So essentially, this is what makes a story. This is kind of how I differentiate stories and everything from, say, math equations. Even though no matter how many times you read a story, the ending and the end result is the same. You know, there's the classic tortoise and the hare from one of Aesop's fables, where you have no matter how many times you read the story, the ending is always the same. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? What does it matter? Why is that important at all? And it's because when we reread a story, you can get lost in the story and you kind of lose that. You basically regain that idea of the potential to fail. There's potential that there could be something he could have failed, if you know the ending. He could not have succeeded, basically, at that point. And that's kind of what sets it apart from, I would say, the math equations. Because if you think about it, it's all symbols. It's all, A to B, basically, point A to B. But it's this potential to fail is what gives this the whole conflict. So this is your conflict for a story. This is it in a nutshell, essentially. So we have the evil Ritsu arc, which is really good for a few reasons. One, adds a source of conflict. It's a emotion. And it provides a challenge. So what we talked about last time in the previous one was where Mob was let's see, this is my token. I guess you'd call it for Mob. And this is the overpowered symbol. So he's an overpowered character, so he needs something to challenge him. So in terms of raw strength, there's nothing that can challenge him. But if he's going up against his brother, this adds an obvious source of potential conflict where it's okay, so it's no longer just a question of strength, it's a question of he's going against his brother. So all this does really well, and he starts it off very nicely too, in the aspect that it's not immediate that evil Ritsu is going to come into contrast with his brother. It's not immediately obvious. If you see it, if you kind of know where it's going and potentially you can guess at it, that is definitely an option. But essentially what he's doing is he's using this to protect his brother. So it's kind of this good kind of I'm trying to think, what did you call the good knight fallen, the fallen knight basically aspect, where the knight who tries to save the kingdom, who eventually loses himself, so then he comes back at a later point trying to get revenge on said kingdom. Basically kind of that aspect, that archetype, if you want to call it that. So this was really well done just in terms of adding for extra conflict and building up his brother. This is some character development for the brother as well, for Ritsu, and it also gives Mob kind of another aspect, because remember we have this, he's an overpowered character, so we have to continually find ways to make it challenging. Otherwise, you know, it's just Mob going throughout his day, and there's no difference. There's no difference for it. And this kind of works really well because we have basically, I think from towards the latter end of the season, like 7 or 8 or so, somewhere in there, we have the introduction in the series. Let's move this over to Claw, which is kind of provides the greater plot point for it. So generally what you'll see with these types of series, or just series in general, is usually the first 2/3. Let's see, 2/3 is kind of daily, what you call daily dues, or daily plots, essentially. And then these all build into the final part, which is the main plot point. And so all this will usually lead into it, so there'll be hints for it. So it's like, oh, we're chasing after so-and-so, we saw him, but he got away. But this is usually how the breakdown ends up. Because basically this gives you the chance to add up like kind of a sequence of comfort. It's pretty easy plot-wise to come up with this. So we have repetition structure of school. We have the club activities, and we have Mob's job, basically. So all these kind of give us stuff to do, essentially. So we can kind of repeat these different points over and over again to kind of give it some structure. It gives it some rhythm, it makes the story writing easy, and it lets us kind of just have the characters interact to each other. This is the reason why the highly structured plots are really very, very popular in terms of murder mysteries. You see this where it's, you know, the whodunit murder of the week. Trying to think of the other. Supernatural does it with monster of the week, essentially, and they kind of go from one area to another, and they have a different monster, and it's kind of this very comfortable formula. Sitcoms usually do it in terms of day-to-day lives. There's this kind of repetition of work, free time, and kind of the conflict, romance, and everything that falls out from there. Naruto would usually do this. In terms of the ninja school is the biggest one. I feel like a lot of people do that. There's a reason why the whole school, Harry Potter, the school aspect is just very easy for it to come up with a good rhythm to it. Because there's this good line I heard from someone who's like, you never want too many choices, essentially. Because we've got some geese outside. They're probably headed south for winter. At least it sounds like geese. I don't know what they are. Essentially, you have this. Now I lost my train of thought. Dumb geese. So I'll have to skip that. Then, essentially, so you have this. You never want too many free choices, because a story where you can do anything, usually what you end up doing is nothing. You end up staring at a blank page and going, oh my gosh, I could do anything, and then from that, you basically just draw a blank. And essentially that's all you have to work with. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to constrict the story in such a way that it gives you all the options that you want, but at the same time it really just lets you continue to build the story from this. Because it's kind of like essentially stories in board games share a decent amount of similarities in the fact that, you know, nobody wants to play a board game without rules. Because while you can do anything, all the time you're just going to do nothing. You know, playing Monopoly without rules, playing Monopoly in general is usually a bad idea, but, you know, if you're going to pick Monopoly without rules versus with rules, you know, everyone will have their own preference. So anyway, so we have the introduction of Claw, and this kind of adds the larger dramatic and conflict points. So if we have kind of the daily, because all this is seen in contrast to each other. So you have this rising action with this point, you have rising action here with this point. Oops. Let me move this out of the way. There we go. rising action over here, and then you have rising action over here, and then you'll have falling action as we kind of reset back to normal. And this could be a season or an episode. And so what you want, if it is an episode, is this, this starts back at 0, where they kind of learn something, you gather something, and then it goes into the next episode. And you do have to keep, basically each next episode is going to live in the shadow of this one. So you can follow the same plot points, but in terms of how the audience feels and everything, you really have to keep track of that, because you do have to kind of continually keep this idea of conflict and usually suspense, but that really can be just baked into conflict, because the suspense of you don't know what's going to happen next. So this is the reason why we're over here. If we have Mob, he unleashes his powers and exercises the ghost, you got to have a new reason to suspect and be interested into what's going on here. And this could be, Mob tries to, I'm trying to think of something directly from the show. I'm thinking of season 2, but I would say Mob basically in social interactions. This is a completely new ball game for him. Or Mob trying to join the body improvement club, where basically he's working on a different axiom, which lets us start at 0, because that gives us an easy way to continue to create this rising action, create this rising action, and then from there, but also at the same time doesn't let us betray what we've done so far. So this is the reason why sequels usually fail and do so pretty poorly, is because during the first story they get all the way up to this point and they fall, and the audience in the sequel is remembering this point. They're like, okay, so we've got this figured out. And then right here they usually go back and immediately erase this point. And once it's erased, and they do that so they can start back at 0 again, so they can have this rising action. Now, you might say, what's wrong with starting with? Why not start at, we're at 10, 9,000, whatever the number is. Why not start? There's the geese are back. Ducks or whatever. Basically, why not start there? And this is where you kind of run into the scale issue, basically. And this is where Dragon Ball Z is probably the one that has the biggest and hardest time kind of dealing with everything in this regard. So Dragon Ball Z. So usually the way Dragon Ball Z's are started was initially you have to be the strongest Goku going on fights, and he's the strongest in his town. And then you move on to a city, and then you move on to country. And this is not exactly how it falls in Dragon Ball Z, but there's this clear arc. Country, and then it's planet, and then it's solar system, and then, I don't know, solar, since this is Dragon Ball Z, System 2, basically. And essentially what he's doing is he's going up this arc, and essentially this is what provides this idea of this rising suspense. Remember, we continually need to be rising conflict, because you don't want to continually have, oh, well, Goku's still the strongest guy in the town. Aren't we so happy that he's still number 1 for 12 seasons in a row? No. Once we're... Because this is what, happens in everyone's life. They really, really want something, and once they finally get it, it's nice and great, and they're very grateful for it, and then they're on to the next thing. And this is how we are. This is how stories need to work. Because, remember, if the 4th season of just having the same thing that you had in season 1, there's no conflict. There's no suspense from that. There's no potential to fail at that point. Because, listen, there's no reason to suspect why he would actually lose the 5th time in a row for being the strongest person in the town. But now we're moving on to the strongest person in the city. This is where it can add some issues with it. And so what you end up with, what they ended up with, is they have, the ridiculous number of levels, basically, for how strong Goku is, and which is why you get onto Super Saiyan God, which is just, at this point, it's kind of, it's silly and ridiculous, but we all love it, so, we're going to forgive it. But at the same time, there's this question of scale, and this is, in a sense, is 9,000, we'll call it. And over here, this scale right here is 1. So, in the sequel now, we don't really want Goku to start off at 1 again. Once you get all the way up, all the story that we've gone through, everything that got this, the payout and the value that we get from it is in the fact that he's now level 9,000. The problem though is in any sequel, let's say in sequel, however you spell sequel, we're going to say this is sequel. I keep wanting to spell squall. Let's see, sequel. There we go. Got it. First try. The sequel, let's change my pen out here real quick. For the sequel, what you want is you then have to start, you want to start at a 0. Now the other reason why you want to start off at 0 is because if you're going to this point, and these always need to be proportional, because you never want them to go down, you want them to go up. So if this is at 9,000, this has got to be like, we'll say 18,000 from here. So if this just becomes infinitely harder than, let's say, 1, 2, let's say 1,000. This could be Goku at the beginning of Dragon Ball Z. This could be Goku after that, the tournament arc, basically, from there. The tournament arc from there. And so what you have to have from here is then you have to start off with Super Saiyan God. And then how do we top that? What does that even mean? You know, he's already the strongest guy in the solar system, so we have to start adding stuff. We have to, okay, so he's got to fight Big Muscle Jesus. And this is what represents this. And it just becomes a lot harder to really create and craft this. This is the reason why sequels oftentimes will be like to immediately erase everything in the previous one and just immediately start back at 0. Now, that's kind of option 1. That's the poor way to do it. The better way to do it is simply to change the dynamic. And that's what this Mob Psycho does really well, where it goes, okay, so Mob's really strong. And this is where we know he's strong enough to defeat X, let's say Dimple in this instance. So let's say Dimple, let's draw him. Let's see, he's got his dimples. And he's got hands. He's gonna have weird fingers, and then he's got eyeballs. I'll give him eyeballs because then his dimples look like eyeballs. There's Dimple. Let's color these in. Yeah, there we go. So, defeating Dimple is right here, and then we can start here, so this is a different aspect. So it could be a different type of monster. It doesn't necessarily have to be reinventing the wheel. You don't have to go from, to use a cooking analogy, let's go cooking. It doesn't have to be going from cooking to, say, horse riding. So let's say these are buildable skills that we are enjoying our, the main character works for to get. It could just be going from 1 P1, P2. And this could be the difference. This could be the difference that adds that different aspect of starting out here and then going in episode 2 to here. Recipe 1, Recipe 2. And this is kind of what it does, and this works for a bit. So let's say Recipe in Mob Psycho, this is going to be Ghost 1, Ghost 2. And then eventually, though, we're going to get bored with this, so we've got to change this whole dynamic from there. And it could be in different ways. It could be, we could go to a Super Ghost. And now this changes it and lets us recreate this whole dynamic from it. And we could eventually get into the point where how to actually play and break this whole aspect of it. The problem is there's a reason why this is the staple. And so at some point later we'll probably go into how to break this sequence and kind of what that would look like and most importantly how to do it well, because I don't really consider it viable. You can do something poorly, but we're not really interested in that. So we're not going to go too much in there. So this is what it does really well, and this is what adds the element. And this is something that Mob Psycho, when I talk about how it's a lot harder to do it when you're starting off at 9,000. This is, to some degree, this is what Mob Psycho is doing for themselves, because Mob is an overpowered character. However, they're continually changing it and everything from there. And the other thing is, like, realistically, even in Naruto, where he's not seen as overpowered, basically what I would call, he still wins in the end. So it's kind of like they go through the same struggle. It's just for Mob, it's a lot easier, basically, because that's just the strength gaining is not really the point of his story and everything. He's kind of focused. The focus of his story is a little bit different for it. But yeah, so we've got these two moments from here, and this is kind of what gives us that. I'm trying to think where we were going from here. Yeah, we were just talking, I guess, just talking about what did really well. So, and this is kind of what you want from these to go from episode to episode, but then this also follows the same season to season story. That's right. So the next season, the season finale basically follows with us facing against Claw. So we faced against Claw and all their minions and everything from like there. So let's go ahead and go over here. Get some clean paper. Over here. So, and this is kind of what adds to this. Let's say right here. So this is what we're recreating. Remember, this could be our episode or a season. So eventually, this is where the Claw guys come into. Claw guys, because they're added to this, they're super powerful. They're more powerful than anyone we've ever seen so far. From here, and that's always how it works. Is this kind of the classic Legend of Zelda dungeon progression, where it just is enough to stretch you and it gives you everything you need, but then it's also a challenge. But then it's this kind of continual, gradual progression up of complexity, difficulty, and all that. So we're adding this up, we're building the brother up. This is where kind of in the latter half of the season where we're really starting to ramp up the story. And this is where it kind of all starts to culminate. Because remember, we want the stories to work on this rising action in terms of this is how the conflict and suspense from there. And because that just is the type of story we're trying to tell right now. There are stories where it is a lot more muted. Kind of like this. I would say Slice of Life does this generally quite well. I'm trying to think of the name. It's Yokohama Kidashi Kidao or something. I say YKK, maybe they make zippers there. But anyway, that's a good one. Aria is another. Yatsuba. I'm trying to think. Way of the House Husband. Way of the House Husband. All of these kind of are slice of life, and these are different types where like this point, because remember this point is relative. This point is relative. Now there is going to be a different sequence where in Way of the House Husband, for example, he just goes shopping or something for a good deal. But there is this idea where the audience will understand that this is a success from whatever the characters say. Now it has to be believable to a certain degree, but so long as it's believable enough, it'll work. So you could have something like this moment. Hayao Miyazaki does this really well. Let's just say in Totoro, where there's really not too much in the way of this the whole way until the very end when they're off looking for their mom and they get lost and everything and then they get safe, and they were never really in too much danger, but again it's relative to it. So it's like there was zero conflict before and they're kids and everything's magical and great, and so they have this sequence of kind of up and down. This is how I think through it. So for Claw, we've got this and we've got this rising action, and we're preparing this so that way we can end the season on a bang. Because remember, you don't generally want the best part of your season to be up here in the beginning. You don't really want the highest point of action to go this way unless you're just telling that type of story. And so we basically identified from here that Mob Psycho is not that kind of story. We want to follow the more, I guess you'd call it the traditional story arc and conflict arc from there, the traditional one, as opposed to like the slice of life or anything like that. So we're going to follow the traditional way. And so what this means is this is the reason why we have to introduce stronger people. How do we do that? The tool we're going to use to introduce stronger people is by doing super secret organization from there. And we introduce this, and this kind of gives us the reason why there's so many strong people. Because remember, in terms of world building and world sequence, you have to ask your question, what are these guys doing? If you're going to pull out of your hat, essentially, if you're going to introduce a character who's super smart, super strong, and powerful, and all this, the question is, what were they doing? before they came into the story. You do need to answer this, because they can't just be, because remember, they have to follow the logic of their own character. And the reason why is because this is just adds to this aspect of world building. Because world building, oftentimes, most audience members will not really recognize or understand too much in terms of world building. What they're going to be looking for is terms of is it good or bad. And the way I think of this in terms is, again, if we're going to go to steal something out of cooking from here, you know, you may not know why a dish is good or bad, but you know that it tastes good. Good or bad from there. And it tastes good or bad from there, and that's all you really need to know at the same point. That's all you need to know for the audience member. Now, they might not be able to break down why, but this is a bit of a tangent from our main point for this one, but it does have to follow the logic of their character. So we're using this organization to introduce strong characters. What have they been doing this whole time that Mob's been going to school and everything like that? Well, they've been working on world domination and everything from there. That's what they've been very busy building up, this whole organization, and they're building up all this stuff and all this organization and all these powerful people in time for Mob to come in at this point. Because remember, we want to have this rising climax, and honestly, each one of these microcosms is going to follow the same. If we were to zoom in on this guy, it's going to follow maybe something like that. Who knows? It kind of just depends on that. And that's what the microcosm acts like. Because what we want to do is we want to have an introduction to this fight, kind of a build-up. So they talk, they monologue, then they fight. And there's a break, and then they fight, and then a break, and there's something like that. Or you're fighting different people, however you want to do it. This doesn't really matter. The important thing is you do want the continual action. Because remember, the general questions I like to ask is, you know, where is this conflict coming from? Where's the conflict coming from? Is it coming from a weak opponent or a strong opponent? Okay, if it's a weak opponent, why doesn't Mob immediately destroy them? Well, maybe he doesn't destroy them because they're, you know, his brother. Or something like that. They're his brother, or I don't know, they seem nice. You know, kind of these different, you have to have some aspect and a reason and explanation for why he doesn't immediately win. Where does the conflict come from? Where does this come from? Again, because that's the type of story we're telling. We're not telling one without like a slice of life or anything like that, or kind of a, because there are different stories you can do it, and you can do it really successful. I mean, Wind in the Willows, to a large degree, there is kind of conflict, but at least definitely at the end, but it's kind of a muted, just kind of a lazy summer day type story. At least that's how I remember it. Maybe that's a bad example. We'll just stick with the slice of life then. For the slice of life ones, basically what they're doing is they're offering up a different formula than the normal type of conflict and everything like that. So again, if you're going to change anything like this, you do need to answer these questions. Where is the conflict coming from? And so far, these different stories, and this is what Mob Psycho does quite good, is it basically is taking this aspect of, okay, we're going to have a series of fights. Okay, so then what makes these fights different? You know, what does they do that makes these fights worthwhile? Why do I care about this fight versus that fight? Because remember, they're all fights. Mob's really strong. We kind of know this different aspect, and this is where kind of the different parts of it, kind of you do want to really focus on making sure and figuring out the best way to tell these different stories and keep this suspense going. So one option is Mob doesn't want to violate his values. He's got values. Don't use your powers against people. So there's the conflict. Conflict comes from there. He's got to save his friends. So you're not just fighting to win, you're fighting to save friends. Because they could die. They could die. Other people are fighting. So you got Hanazawa. I think that's his name. Essentially, he's the tall toupee guy at this point in the story. So he could be fighting. So that's where other conflict can come. This is a clever use of side characters because they can die. They can die because the story is not about them directly. So it's more likely that they'll die rather than Mob. This is something that Hunter X Hunter does really, really, really well, where it's basically playing on this idea, and they go full to crazy lengths to develop side characters and introduce them and carry them around, and then kind of move them to the side. You know, Kurapika, I don't know. No, it's the chain guy. Kind of looks like a girl sometimes. Whatever his character arc is from there. He was an example for that. There's the guy who lost all of his hair. I can't remember. He was the glasses dude. And then he eventually lost his hair, so he had like three hairs or something. His character was like that. That was kind of in the ant, the army ant, the iron ant. I can't remember what the ants, whatever the ant arc is. It's been a while since I've seen it. Whatever the ant arc is, kind of from there. So all these things are adding different aspects of conflict from the story. The most obvious one is the person is stronger. So you can have strong person. How do I spell it? Person. And we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then boss. Something like that. That's generally how a lot of these work. Now, you can add multiple ones of these, and that's what oftentimes they will do. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this one. We're going to have conflict of values. We're going to add that into here. We're going to have a side character in here. We're going to have the evil brother somehow plays an aspect. Evil Ritsu in here. And then we have, let's say, all 3 of these aspects kind of combine and go into the final boss. The final boss from here. And this is what adds this extra, this building complexity, building conflict from here. Because you don't want it to be more boring. But at the same time, it's not really satisfying if you start off at the highest point here, because we don't understand why. We don't really know. So that's why you do need to build it up from here. You can always start it off to some degree, but at the same time, most of the time, the audience is just going to be lost. So you do need time and story and plot to build up to this point. And so then we have this different aspect where fighting the final boss and everything like that. And it's also at the same time, this is generally, I don't know, it kind of gets into the bigger question of what is a story and how stories. There does seem to be a format, a quote-unquote correct format for a story, and I say correct just in terms of what works. Because what you want to do is make sure that you have a story that's good, because nobody really cares about a story that's bad, that breaks the mold. The good ones are always the ones that take this mold and really play with it and adapt it and kind of build it into something better and something newer, while at the same time it's good. I used to have this, so I used to be a lot more prudish in terms of what I would watch and everything like that, in terms I didn't like stuff with a lot of violence or sexuality or language or anything like that. But just because I was pretty new to all that, and I generally didn't think stories needed like that. I've changed a little bit in that. I do think some of it is for accuracy. Most of it's because of ease. But that's another question. Lost my train of thought again. But yeah, basically, is the better the story was, the more people are willing to put up with it. Better the story. Which is why, just as an interesting one, like that's the reason why, I don't know, there's all kinds of horrible things that we're willing to put up with in a story. Like, let's say, how do you feel about watching a story about a murderous killer? Let's see. Killer attacks a family and kills, let's say, 100 or so, children. 100 or so children. And that's it. Let's say right there. Let's say, who wants to read this story? Turns out, a lot of people do. One, because you kind of disguise it in there. Turns out this is the opening scene to Finding Nemo. Oops, that was an E. Finding Nemo, a murderous killer attacks a family and kills 100 or so children. This is seemingly a terrible premise, but this is the opening to Finding Nemo. And so what it is we're willing to put up with it because it's engaging. They do it really well. They do it very tastefully. They don't show it'd be a very different You just think of it in terms of what is the audience willing to put up with, in terms of kids movies, they're willing to put up with different stuff from adult movies, movies with rape in them. You're going to lose a lot of people for that just because a lot of people don't want to deal with that. Scenes with torture in it, that one's a really hard one for people to watch for a number of reasons. Murder even, although everyone seems to be pretty okay, normal, good with murder at this point with all the murder mysteries that we've got going on. But all of these are different things that the audience essentially has to put up with, and they do so depending on how good it is and how well balanced. And good, I'm going to cheat a little bit and load that with everything in terms of how well done. Do you show the kids getting murdered? No? Okay, well that's good. I, as an audience member, don't want to see that and everything. So what we've got here then for Mob is we really have this very good, very traditional, because that's the thing. Nothing in this typical plot point, where are we at? Right here. None of this is new. None of this is crazy or anything like that. It's just they basically, from episode to episode, they don't mess this up. And you don't want to mess this up. Because this is kind of what is the building blocks and the bread and butter, as it were, for a lot of stories. And you want to make sure that you get this right and kind of understand, okay, this is what often makes sequels bad, because they don't understand this aspect of it. They basically erase everything and start from zero, or they don't build on what the previous one was because they don't know how to do it. The worst example, at least the one that I always think of for terrible sequels, is National Treasure. I love the first one. It's great mystery, adventure, suspense, all that. They get everything. At the end of the movie, Nicolas Cage gets the girl. He gets, the fame and everything like that. And then at the beginning of the second movie, what do? They just take it all away. They don't go, okay, now you two are married. You don't go to the next stage. You don't level up from there. So let's say, that's fine. So let's say right here, this is single, and this is married, and we'll have different plot points. So this is married and single. This is the first movie. And so on the second movie, what we're going to do is we're going to start with married, and we're going to work towards, there's a few different options you can go. The typical one is child. We're going to have kids from there. Or it could be something of, what do we want in this marriage? Are we happy in this marriage? There's different things you can build, because we were sold this idea in the first one that they were going to be happily ever after once they got married. But then immediately with the sequel, they just bring it back. And so we go from single again to married. And this is the sequel of the second one. So we're going from here to here, and this is dumb. Like, we've already been through this. Why are we having to go through this again? Same thing with the Riley, the other guy. He gets his car and everything, and then what happens at the beginning of the second movie? Immediately it's taken by the IRS because he can't pay his taxes, and so it's like everything just starts at zero. So it's almost like we didn't learn anything from the first one, and nobody likes that, which is the reason why you do want to have this continual building arc, this aspect of we're building on what we've learned so far, we're building on the plot points, and we're moving up. And it doesn't even mean that by the end of 12 episodes the person's a master of 12 different things. It could be small things. The idea of the recipe. It's a chef. It's a cooking show. We're trying to do it, and we have recipe 1. We've mastered that. Haha. But now we've encountered recipe 2, which is even harder or even differenter, or whatever the metric is. Or you go from cooking recipe to something crazy different. In season 2, I'm at the beginning. Just saw the first episode. We have Mob, who's introduced with social situations, and he's always been terrible with those. How is he going to do it, and everything from there? But this is just something that I wanted to go through, because this is just, for a lot of shows, you really do need to nail this aspect. You need to understand what's going on here, and it kind of helps to be able to see it and go, oh, okay, so this story, they kind of have this aspect, and they kind of resolved it, and so this is what our takeaway is. So for them, for the next episode, we can start here, and usually it doesn't start back at square zero unless, and again, there's always this idea of correct. It's whatever works. You can always break this formula. Question is, what are you losing when you break the formula, and what did the formula do that you now have to recreate? If you're going from A to B, let's see, and let's say the most direct path is like this. If you're going to do this, you have to have an answer for it. So it's like, okay, so this one's nice because it's nice and straightforward. Maybe this is super complicated. So why is it overly complicated? Why wouldn't the reader or audience member in this case feel like their time is being wasted, that they're just being thrown around, that if the two characters would just sit down in a room and have a conversation, this wouldn't happen, and everything like that. You have to figure out a reason in terms of what does the audience want, why are they putting up with this, and why would all that. You have to break that down and kind of be able to answer that question from there. But yeah, we'll see. I think I want to kind of continue to talk about Mob Psycho. It's really well done. I'm really enjoying it, and I hope you guys are as well. And yeah, as always, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.